Hello, it's Anthony Chadwick from the Webinar Vet, welcoming you to another episode of VETchat. And I'm really pleased today to be able to chat to Edie Bowles, who is a lawyer and also the founder of the Animal Law Foundation. Edie, thank you so much for agreeing to come on the show. Tell us a little bit about your background. How come you became a lawyer and then really got interested in the animal law side of things?
Thank you so much, Anthony, for the introduction and for having me on this podcast. It's a real pleasure to be here and to talk to a new audience, actually, about the work that we do at the Animal Law Foundation. The reason I became a lawyer, and indeed an animal lawyer, is probably the same reason that lots of people become a vet, which is because I have a deep passion for animal protection, animal welfare, and making sure that animals receive the treatment that they should by humans, essentially. Animal law is one of those areas that, we do have a body of animal legislation, but what's lacking is the lawyers making sure that that legislation is enforced and is interpreted how we argue it should be. So really that is the reason why I became an animal lawyer. I just recognized that there was a huge gap of the enforcement of animal protection legislation. My background, actually, I was an intellectual property lawyer for a few years before an opportunity came up at an animal charity to do this work, where I now ensure that the law is being applied. And then when at that charity, I realised that actually the animal space more broadly could do with experts scrutinising all of the animal legislation really that exists and making sure that it's functioning as we say it should. So that's really the reason why I got into animal law, just noticing that gap and filling that gap.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because as Brits, we're talked of as being a nation of animal lovers. Obviously, vets as well. I would think 99.9% of vets love animals, and yet there are areas. Certainly as a student, as a young vet, we heard about things like veal crates. They were banned in the UK, but of course, cattle would then, or calves would just be sent over to Europe to live in the same sort of conditions. So it needs to be that sort of fully joined up process from start to finish. Obviously, we're not part of the EU now, but give us a few examples of areas that you think animal law is being flouted.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, and there's some really good examples that you've just raised, and of course there is such alignment between vets and lawyers like myself, with those kind of topics. So it's actually really great to be here today talking to you about it, because I imagine there's probably more of a joined up approach just within the UK, in terms of tackling some of these issues. And of course, vets and lawyers have probably worked very close together on those specific incidents you mentioned. In terms of where animal law is being flouted, sadly, it's systemic is the answer. We've gathered data from all of the relevant public bodies that enforce the welfare of farmed animals, the law that protects the welfare of farmed animals. We've gathered data from all the local authorities, the Food Standards Agency, DEFRA, and that data shows that only 2.5% of farms are being inspected. Of those that are being inspected, 1 in 4 show non-compliance. And of those that show non-compliance, less than 1% are prosecuted. So that shows how systemic this issue actually is. And, my personal view is the reason why there's such a systemic non-compliance and then systemic lack of enforcement is because there haven't been people in this space making sure that it's being applied. And that's what I really hope, the work that we do changes.
I was going to say there was a lot of stuff recently in the papers about farm RSPCA farm assurance schemes, very much making that same point that I'm very careful. I'm not a vegetarian, but I do like to eat meat of very high provenance, so organic, etc., etc. And you look at Red Tractor or you look at RSPCA assured meat, and you kind of hope that that animal is having a better life. But obviously, you're suggesting some of those things, and in fact, the newspapers recently have been suggesting that those schemes are not as good as they should be.
I think it's a great point that you raise. I mean, my view on that is that it shouldn't be left to private players to provide that information to the public. It should be, it should be standardized, it should be official, and there should be labeling around, around how these products, the provenance of these products, the husbandry practices, the
Yeah.
method of production. And in fact, that just doesn't exist. The only two areas that it exists for animal farming is with eggs, so hens that produce eggs, and for fish, method of production when it comes to fish. Whereas aside from those, there's just no standardized official labeling. And of course, the consumers, private players are left to plug that gap, and the consumer is none the wiser as to what this stuff means. And so, one solution to the problem you've just identified is that official labeling is put in place, which lots of groups actually are lobbying for.
Hmm. The trouble is sometimes, government then takes so long for these things to happen. One of my passions, I remember I was a student in the 80s, and I remember reading a vet record, finding one, in the last few years from the 80s, and we were talking about non-stun slaughter.
Mhm.
That was in the 80s, and the practice still continues. Obviously, it's for religious reasons. I get that. But we still don't know, if that meat has been stunned or not, halal or
Mm.
shikita. So it's very difficult, isn't it, to make those kind of laws stick. My belief is every animal has a right to be stunned, has a right to a happy life and a happy death. We saw all of the secret videos coming out about abattoirs where people were treating the animals,
Mm.
cruelly and mockingly. It is enough to put you off eating meat if we can't trust the system.
So it's a really good point. And to be honest, you're right. We shouldn't be naive to the fact that politics can slow down these kind of improvements that we need to see within the animal space. But I think that, even having this conversation today, talking to this new audience, is part of that process to raise awareness, because I imagine, a lot of the political will is not there because there's not enough public pressure, when in fact, as you said, we do declare ourselves a nation of animal lovers, and I believe that to be true. So I think if we do raise awareness around this stuff, the public will do what they need to do, and then the MPs and the decision making in the government will follow. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of awareness, and to be honest, one of the projects that we're actually working on is actually about the misinformation that exists within the kind of food supply chain. Because I do think the public has just been kept in the dark about a lot of this stuff, which is resulting in a complacency around purchasing decisions, and then also around the need to even respond, because people aren't even aware that there's an issue at this stage. So we just really need to kind of shine a light on that stuff, and I think the political will then follow.
Because of course, people also want, and in these straitened times, people want cheap food, and obviously,
Mm.
once the food is, you're only judging it on a price perspective. A lot of this stuff that, of course, should be happening, you can understand why, if farmers are being pushed for their margins by supermarkets, etc., they start to try and potentially cheat the system a bit and ignore some of the rules that are out there, can't you?
Completely, completely. Although, there is data to show that when the labeling of method of production for eggs came in, the purchase of free range eggs went up by 43%. So there is evidence to suggest that people will pay more money, if it's getting them a product that aligns more closely with their
Yeah.
values. Whereas currently, people are able probably or willing to buy cheaper meat because they're not being exposed to the reality of what that means.
Of where it's from. I must admit, for all my adult life, I've always gone for free range or potentially barn eggs because obviously there was a good welfare on that. And of course, you can have a free range chicken that's kept appallingly outside as well. So extensive doesn't always mean better than
Mm.
slightly more intensive. But as part of my training, I had to work in a chicken farm in a battery situation, and it was it almost made me weep that the chickens
Mm.
were so confined. So thank goodness that those sort of days are behind us. I think on the whole, there's very few battery cages in the UK now, although I suspect they're in in other countries as well. So that's a great point. I know recently you had an article in the Vet Times all around docking of pigs, which I
Mm.
believe has created quite a lot of interest. So perhaps tell us a little bit about that story. Of course, not all of us are large animal vets. Certainly, fewer of us are actually working in pig practice. So perhaps explain what the situation is, what it should be, and how we can perhaps move in the right direction in that area as well. Because I know you've obviously been looking at that with particular interest as an example of welfare abuses.
Thanks, Anthony. I think it's a really important conversation to be had, and I'm delighted with the awareness that has already been raised in the veterinary community in relation to the docking of pigs' tails. I think it's really important to be having these conversations with such a key stakeholder in animal welfare. So, just very, very briefly, on the face of it, it's illegal to mutilate, to dock a pig's tail. If done routinely, it can only be done as a last resort when other management measures have been attempted first to remove the need to dock the tail. So tail docking happens because pigs bite each other's tails. They resort to biting each other's tails when they are put into environments that make them agitated, dissatisfied, bored. All of these psychological traits lead to aggressive behaviors. So one way to combat that is to avoid those psychological traits arising. So providing suitable enrichment, providing suitable temperatures, providing suitable space. Those husbandry practices will prevent or should prevent some of those aggressive behaviors that lead to tail biting, which leads to the need to tail dock. However, what we see in practice is anywhere between 70 to 85% of pigs in the UK having their tails docked. Now, what we argue is that this strongly suggests that there is systemic tail docking going on, tail docking taking place on a routine basis, something which is contrary to the law. What adds a kind of another dimension to this is that, in fact, vets are the ones that need to authorise the docking of pigs' tails. So we're very interested to learn more about that, as to how the vets are satisfying themselves that it's not routine, if the data suggests that it's taking place anywhere between
Yeah.
70 to 85% of cases. Now, we know that vets, get into this profession because they care about animals. And I imagine that there's lots of reasons as to why a vet may feel the need to authorise this docking of the tail. But we want to kind of understand more about that. We want the regulators of the veterinary community to understand more about that, because what we don't want to see is vets compromising their integrity or compromising their oath towards animal health and welfare because of the pressures perhaps from their human paying clients, rather than putting the animal's interests first. So we really, at this stage, it's actually a desire to understand more, and
Mm.
a call on the regulator, the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons, to investigate and to find out more, rather than just accept the status quo of this 70 to 85%.
Yeah, it's evidence based, isn't it? If there's 80%, then it's not routine. It's kind of happening pretty much to most pigs, which presumably when we put them into a more extensive system, then we see less injury to tails and therefore less tail docking. Is that correct in an extensive system?
Absolutely. I mean, intuitively, it's correct. We don't see tail biting in the wild, for example. So it's not a behavior that pigs would ordinarily do. If pigs had space to hide, if pigs had space to forage, to root, if they had space to remove themselves from an aggressor, we're going to see a reduction in tail biting and therefore the need for tail docking. So it is really a symptom of the intensive model, the industrial animal farming model that exists. But the law is the law, and we set these standards where we set them, and it's just a shame to see them ever diluted. And so that's, yeah, what we really want to, in fact, that's what the Animal Law Foundation wants to do. It wants to ensure that those standards that are in place do mean something in practice. And in a way, it's a plea to the veterinary community to that are involved in this, to also do what I imagine they want to do, which is really explore the why. Like, why is this happening, and how can we.
And I think as you said, the law protects vets. I remember going to see a downer cow early on in my career, and I was chatting to the farmer, and I said, what have you given the cow? And they'd just given it some antibiotics the day before. I said, well,
Mm,
that's not safe now to go into the human food chain. Oh, well, can you not just sign the certificate anyway? No, because that would be illegal. So this gives us the benefit of not having to fight all of those cases of saying, oh, well,
mm.
actually, yeah, maybe I can because there's no law. But obviously, I wouldn't want to be eating meat that's laced with antibiotics, and I'm sure neither would you either. So I think the law is really important to make also vets' lives easier as well, because if this is happening, as I say, the majority of the time, and often, I remember reading Sean Wensley's book. Sean's a good friend of mine through a vet's eyes, and he was saying, a lot of the behavioural things that we see, you have to take it back to husbandry. If we get the husbandry right, and we can do that in intensive as well as extensive systems, then there should be less vices, like the pigtail biting that you're talking about.
That's so interesting, and that rings true, that story you gave about the antibiotics, because you know anecdotally I've also heard that there will be pig vets out there that do not want to be authorizing these tail docs, but they'll feel that if they don't, another pig vet
Yes.
will. Which is why that conversation needs to happen at the top. It needs to
Yeah.
happen with the Royal College. It needs to, they need to take a kind of a leadership role on this and really understand what's going on, understand the why, and look at those solutions. And it really, and then on the ground the onus is on the vet to to remember their oath, to remember that their primary duty is towards animal health and welfare, not towards the economics of
Yes.
the intensive farming model. And I imagine lots of that gets lost in the pressures of a job, but actually we should be kind of taking a step back and remembering that stuff.
I think, as you've said from the article in the Vet Times, and then obviously some of the responses that you've had, vets are a bit frustrated by the system. But as you said, if they think, well, if I don't do it, another practice vet will come in and do it, then, it is a difficult situation for them, isn't it?
Very. I mean, the frustrating thing is DEFRA's code of practice does have guidelines on the environmental measures you can take to reduce the risk of tail biting. And it's just, I've seen so much undercover footage over the years, and those measures are just not taking place. Really, really kind of basic things like ensuring that pigs have dry bedding, ensuring that the temperature's right, ensuring that there's space, ensuring that there's enrichment materials. Instead, you do these undercover, or you see these undercover investigations rather, and there tends to just be a chain hanging up as though that's sufficient for these highly intelligent animals. So the guidelines, if even if those guidelines, were followed, which are really at the minimum, then we would see less of a need. And instead, we seem to just be I we seem to be complacent, I think, within this intensive model, and thinking that it's normal when it's not. And the standard is actually set higher than what we're seeing in practice. I mean, it's also, I mentioned the enforcement problem at the start of this conversation. And I think that, again, it's kind of just indicative of the fact that no one's been monitoring. And as a result of that, on the ground, the standards have been going down. And in fact, actually, no, let's press the reset and get things to where they should be.
As you say, if you see a farm where there's 20% of tail docking, then they're obviously doing a much better job than at 80%. But this is also where I think the private sector, the supermarkets, should be going in and checking on standards, as well as having, DEFRA or ministry inspectors that are going into farms, because, an exception, if it's 10 to 20%, we could probably maybe live with it. But 80% seems incredibly high, and obviously indicative of animals that are not thriving in the environment that they're in. And, if an animal isn't thriving, as well as its welfare being affected, its health's being affected, it probably isn't going to grow as quickly and reach the target weight, at which it'll be slaughtered. So a happy animal is probably also better from an economic perspective. We have to use less antibiotics, etc., which is another challenge that we've got at the moment. So a lot of these things come together. We can look at tail docking as a siloed situation on its own, but actually it's much more complex than that, isn't it? There's lots of factors causing that increase in the tail biting.
Completely. I mean, it is indicative of a system, of a problem within the system,
Yeah.
without a shadow of a doubt. I mean, just mentioning kind of what percentage would be happy with. In Finland, it is, prohibited to dock pigs'
Yeah.
tails, and the amount of tail biting, I believe, is at the 1% mark. That's incredible. That suggests that in this country, 70% to 84% is unnecessary. You know, that there is another way of doing things. So there definitely is another way of doing things. And I just think that we have been complacent with this system for too long. And I think the vets, are an important safeguard. The vets, I mean, you could look at it either way. You could look at it kind of both ways with the vets authorising. Currently I think it's quite problematic based on the data that we're seeing, of anywhere up to 85%. But the reassuring thing is that means that vets are there on the ground, looking at these batches, authorising, and therefore, we could really implement that as the important safeguard that it should be for the welfare of these animals.
Edie, I think what we need to do is we need to do a webinar on how to prevent tail biting and therefore the need for tail docking. And I suggest you find the finest Finnish vet and let's do the webinar.
I mean, I love that. That is music to my ears, and I've got access to to pig vets that I know would be delighted to also kind of speak about it from a UK perspective. So yes, if you can help me make that happen, I would love that.
Let's do it, because the whole point of Webinar Vet was to make education more accessible and more affordable. And then therefore, because the vets are better educated, the animals get treated better as well, don't we? So yeah, we'd love to continue with this story because as I say, I think I certainly did, and I'm sure most vets came into the profession because we love animals and we want them to live the best lives that's possible for them. So listen, thank you so much. It's also, I think, so important that sometimes as vets we have people coming from the outside saying, I think you could do better. Or that we go outside and we learn from people as well, because there is a danger. It's a conservative profession. I think it's becoming less conservative with a small c. But we can spend a lot of time navel gazing, and actually going outside, hearing from experts in other fields can be really inspirational. And thank you for being so inspirational today. It's obviously not a problem as a non-practicing vet now, also not having been in the large animal sector for most of my career. I did some large animal early days. So to see that there is this level of a problem, we need to do something about it. And thank you so much that you are carrying the torch for the pigs and for their tails.
Thank you so much, Anthony. It's been lovely to talk to you. And yeah, let's do that webinar.
Thank you so much, Edie. Thank you, everyone, for listening. I know not everybody's a pig vet, but I think it's so important that as vets and nurses, we're aware of some of the issues that are going on, even if they're outside of our particular sector. So I do hope you've enjoyed it, and I do hope we'll see you on a podcast or a webinar very soon. Take care and have